More than aspirin, more than ibuprofen. For headaches, doctors recommend Tylenol the most.
You should have come to work for me, Julie.
Oh, sure. No stress there.
Scented panty line.
Guys, up here got 2 hot dogs, man. You want one? Good sauce.
That's good sauce, too.
Terrible, terrible. Terrible. Anything you say to mind, you better. What we got?
26.
They're not going in, they're just plugging holes. You got it in that well? with it last time, but you didn't call it. We thought he'd get by with it again. Need one more man in there.
Quarterback got him.
Yeah, that was a good one. Pretty well. No one got that. Yeah. They just stood out there. I didn't see anybody get there.
Everybody listen! Yes, your feet are kicking! Yes, your feet are kicking! Go, go, Everybody listen! Everybody listen! Yes, your feet are kicking! Yes, your feet are kicking! Let's go, everyone! Let's go, everyone! It's your round!
Hope he steps up.
It's your round! It's your round! Everybody listen! Everybody listen! Yes, your feet are kicking! Yes, your feet are kicking! Let's go, everyone! Let's go, everyone! It's your round! It's your
How about that bull? How about that bull? Still looks good. You get back on that linebacker. You need to get that linebacker. He's going to go all right. Who's that? Linebacker, Danny Wilson. Danny Wilson. Where's life at? Oh, it's there. Danny's got to get a ball.
On defense, go!
he knew either. Be okay by basketball, man. Boy, Shaun's had a great game. Oh my goodness, what a roll. Darn it. Yeah. I don't know how far you have to get out before it's encroaching.
It's 1 yard either side.
He didn't go a yard.
That's their fan.
Oh, my goodness.
Come on, guys, get the flag.
The Shamblin's back in. Didn't take long on that one, did it? So they call it clip? Cut the side clip? Touch the back of his knee there. Another flag. Sure is. Or it's just paper. Must just be paper.
Come on, Eagles, hold them!
Yeah, I'm looking through black and white too, so even when I got away from the camera, couldn't tell. Second down. Fool me.
Come on, guys, you gotta get the point. Go!
Face mask! Come on, ref! Face mask!
Was that face mask or shirt? I couldn't tell. Shirt?
Come on, now go. Go,
chop. Corn chop. Corn chop.
First flag. I don't think I've seen a 30-yard penalty before. Cool. Huh? What was the penalty? What are you doing? Good job out. Fourth and 20, there's a minute 48 left. Oh, throw it on the ground.
Someone from St. Mary's, please bring a roster to the press box. Again, someone from St. Mary's, please bring a roster to the press box. Thank you.
Discovery Houston, we have you loud and clear.
Okay, they're just awfully quiet.
And Discovery, if you have time, we can get the window debris report.
Okay, we had to turn off UHF as it had, at least I did, because there was some noise on it. I didn't see much of anything out the left window except for just a few particles of ice, and I don't think I heard anything from Blaine either. Susan did see something, Susan and Joey did see something with the photo DTO that they might want to describe.
Okay, Dick, we copy all that.
Okay, Brett, when we were getting set up for the photo DTO, Jerry made a call that he saw something out there that didn't look like an ET tank, and we both went up to the window and took a look, and we saw the ET tank pretty much right below the moon as far as our reference, and we also saw a large, white, irregularly shaped item, which looked probably like one of the largest pieces of ice I've ever seen.
Okay, Susan, and they're telling me here that we've seen that kind of thing before, so that's a good report.
Okay.
And we took some pictures of it as well as the tank. We only got about 12 before we got into sunset, but we'll have some photos of it.
Okay, Dick, that sounds like a good plan. Discovery Houston, you're about 2 minutes and 30 seconds from Tidris East LOS. We see a good config and you have a go for the ohms to burn. After the burn, if you'd like to work block 12 of the post insertion early, that's WCS activation, you have a go to do that. And just a reminder, before we get into post insertion, before we take down the BFS, we need to talk to you about that.
Okay, we understand, and we're good config for the burn.
We'll be picking you up on Diego at MET of 40 minutes.
We'll see you there.
This is Mission Control. Houston Discovery is now passing over the Middle East. It will be moving out of range of NASA's communications satellite system in just about a minute and a half from now. In about just after it moves out of range, in just about 3 minutes from now, it will fire its orbital maneuvering system engines, the two engines located on either side of the tail of the spacecraft, for a total of about 2 minutes and 7 seconds to circularize its current orbit at an altitude of 140 nautical miles. All activities on board have been going very smoothly, with no problems seen by flight controllers on board the spacecraft after a normal ascent and climb to orbit. Upcoming on NASA television will be a post-launch press conference, and that's scheduled to begin in about 15 minutes at about 6:15 p.m. Central Time, 7:15 p.m. Eastern. Again, Discovery's just a few seconds away now from moving out of range of our communications satellite system. We'll regain communications with the spacecraft once we lose touch with it in about 7 minutes. During that time, Discovery's orbital maneuvering system engines will fire to circularize its orbit at an altitude of 140 nautical miles.
Discovery Houston, we're with you through Diego, and we're standing by for a burn report.
Okay, Houston, we had a good ohms 2, and we're in the post ohms 2. Real good residuals on that burn.
Roger, we concur. We see good residuals and post ohms too.
This is Mission Control Houston. Discovery has now moved back within range of our ground tracking station in the Indian Ocean, having completed its ohms engine firing, now in a 140 nautical mile circular orbit, just as planned. On board Discovery, the crew will now begin setting up the spacecraft for their stay on orbit, with the next major milestone in those preparations, the opening of the payload bay doors. That opening of the payload bay doors will be upcoming in just about a half an hour or so, as the crew continues to prepare for a 10-day stay, 9-day stay rather, in orbit. Discovery now passing almost directly overhead of the island of Diego Garcia, on which the NASA ground tracking station is located, which is providing communications with the spacecraft at present.
Discovery Houston, we're a minute and 30 seconds from LOS on Diego. We'll pick you up on the west satellite at an MET of 50 minutes. We see you complete in the ascent checklist and ready to go to post insertion. Just a reminder to hold off on the Ops 2 transition until we get TDRS West AOS.
Okay, we'll hold off on the Ops 2 transition until you're back with us on TDRS.
That's a good copy. We'll see you at 50 minutes.
Mission Control Houston, Discovery is now moving back out of range of our ground tracking station at Diego Garcia. We'll be out of communications with the spacecraft for a brief period now as it, before it again moves within range of our communications satellite system. We expect to pick up communications via the satellite system in just about 2 minutes or so. Again, on board, the crew's moving into setting up the spacecraft for their stay on orbit and their operations with the LiDAR and space technology experiment. Among those activities to set up Discovery for its stay are reconfiguring the computer system on board, transitioning the computers to the software that's used for orbital operations, and then preparing the spacecraft for opening of the payload bay doors. That is the next major milestone for Discovery, the opening of the payload bay doors, upcoming in just about 40 minutes or so. Once the payload bay doors have been opened, the crew will activate the KU band antenna, the small dish-shaped antenna that's deployed above the side of the cargo bay of the shuttle, and that provides high data rate communications between the spacecraft and the ground, including television communications. Once those activities have all been completed successfully, the crew will be standing by for a go for orbit operations. The go for orbit operations is the indication from Mission Control that the spacecraft is in good shape and prepared to stay in orbit for several days and begin operations with the major payloads.
Discovery Houston, we're with you on the west satellite.
Okay, and we're on step 4 of block 1, and we're setting up for a single G2 inbat to go over to Ops 2 and ready for your note.
We concur with single G2, and you have a go for Ops 2.
Okay, a go for Ops 2.
Discovery's crew now transitioning the onboard flight control computers to the software mode that's used for orbital operations. As Discovery also begins moving into daylight again, the crew having already been through the first night of their stay on orbit. Discovery passing south of Australia. Again, on board, the crew is preparing their spacecraft for the stay on orbit. The next major milestone will be opening of the payload bay doors. That upcoming in just about a little more than a half an hour or so, about 35 minutes when they begin opening the doors. All systems on board the spacecraft continue to be in good shape with flight controllers working no problems. At 52 minutes since Discovery's launch, this is Mission Control, Houston.
Good evening. Welcome to our STS-64 post-launch news conference. We have Lauren Shriver, Manager, Launch Integration, Space Shuttle Program, and we have KSC Launch Director Bob Sieg. We'll start with Lauren before your questions.
Thank you, and thanks for coming over tonight. Of course, we in the Space Shuttle Program are extremely happy to have this 64th mission underway now. As you may know from following what we do from day to day, seems like we had our share of work to get ready to go this time. But once again, due to the great teamwork that we have going here in the launch team, and of course today with having to wait on the weather a little bit, our team reached out a little bit and included weather folks from, I think, maybe all over the world by the time we got done. But anyway, we can add to certainly the professionalism of the team that goes to launch a space shuttle, the traits of patience and perseverance, because they did display plenty of those today. We had pretty much a flawless countdown, and we're ready to go right at T0. But then, of course, had to bide our time and make sure the weather was conducive for all the rules that we've set in place. As you know, we like to have everything work out okay, and that includes the weather, which is why we're fairly restrictive on the rules. So once again, we're very, very happy to see this one go, and it sure lightens the load a lot for the rest of the year.
Well, I would echo what Lawrence said. The team here is certainly very happy and proud this evening. The results of all their work were finally rewarded. Yes, it took a little patience at the end, but again, when the weather was good enough to proceed, that's what we did, and it took a few hours to get good enough to proceed. The good part about that from the team standpoint is while you're sitting there and waiting for the weather to improve is when you really want the most out of the hardware, the flight hardware and the ground systems that have to work for the launch. And that performance through the whole launch count process was flawless, which represents the preparation that the team did to get it there. The only item we talked about was a couple of glitches that occurred at one of our consoles, which affected the displays at that console. And other than that, We didn't have anything to talk about from the time we started tanking last night until we had liftoff. So again, it took some patience and it took some time, but like most launches, the harder they are to achieve, the better they feel when they finally go, and everybody feels real good this evening.
Okay, thanks. We'll start with questions. Joe Walsh.
Question for both gentlemen. This is Joe Walsh, Mutual Broadcasting. There seemed to be an extraordinary amount of exuberance in the firing room at liftoff, more than we've heard in a long time for this particular flight. Why was that?
Well, I think it represented the feelings of the team. If you look at it from what happened today, it had already been a long day. You know, we were about 2 hours past the beginning of the window, which we had prepared for, and there was always that element of doubt as whether or not the weather would be good enough. Our previous launch attempt resulted in a pad shutdown, and I think what you saw there was some relief from the frustration that we've experienced over the last few weeks and the last couple of hours to finally get it off the ground. Like I say, the harder they are to get off the ground, the better they feel when they do.
Bill.
Bill Harwood, CBS. I don't know if either one of you can answer this, but do either one of you know what the actual conditions were for RTLS had you had to do one? I mean, were you in or were you out?
I did not keep track and did not make a call. The only thing I can say is visually out the window it looked fine, but they do keep track of that, and we'll be able to get that information from them.
Dan?
Yeah, Dan Billow from Channel 2. Bob, I didn't really get a good listen right when you were coming out of the T-minus 5-minute hold. It sounded like the flight was telling you you can go, but you better hurry. You had to be ready to really hit it at that time. Could you describe that a little bit and about the preparedness and how ready you were to jump all over that chance?
Well, what we do when we're waiting on a single item, either the resolution of a technical problem or the weather, when we know that we're converging on a resolution to whatever's been holding us up, we do all the preparations with the systems that are required to support the remainder of the launch, and we do that preparation while the anomaly resolution is going on. So we are essentially spring-loaded, as it were, so that when the final constraint has been relieved, in this case the weather for RTLS, the launch team is ready to pick up the count essentially within seconds. And that's the way we always posture ourselves when we go into hold for some reason, whether it's a long one or a short one. When we feel we're getting to the end of that hold and there's light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak, we posture ourselves to come out immediately, and we don't re-poll everybody at that point in time. The premise that we work from is that everybody else that was previously go is still go unless they call in for an additional hold.
Just follow it. Was this a case where that really you needed to do that? I mean, if you'd delayed for another minute or two, would you have maybe gone back out? Or
I don't think it was that there was that much urgency. Again, what we were dealing with is your typical Florida weather scenario, and the weather is dynamic. And in this case, it got good enough for long enough to feel confident with proceeding, but a half hour to an hour later, as you know, it can change and go the other direction. So that was the urgency, as it were, associated with this particular call.
Phil Chen?
Phil Chen, Earth News. About coming out of the 9-minute hold, there was something about an aft heater that stayed at 108, I guess, Fahrenheit, and couldn't move from its specified value, but was still within constraint. Can either of you talk about that?
That's the heated purge to the, which is a nitrogen gas purge to the SRB aft skirts, which has a very wide temperature range. And in this particular case, the automatic control, which is managed remotely from the control room, was inoperative. So the ability to switch into a redundant system, as it were, or change the set points if it would get too hot or too cold, were not immediately available to the operator. They could still manage temperature by taking the heaters off or bringing them back on again, but the automatic thermostat, as it were, was not working. In this particular case, on a warm day in Florida, the temperature of the purge, having been established, it probably would have sat there another hour or two without requiring any tweaking whatsoever.
Sounds a bit like the heater on my car. Okay, Lauren, you mentioned this restrictions on the weather rules and the tightness, and that's why the rules exist. But with the mirror missions coming up and the tight launch windows there, you're going to have to loosen these rules. In a situation like this, would this have been a case where either the rules would have been looser, or would you have had a waiver in order to be able to launch within a reasonable launch window?
Well, today, assuming that we would be targeting for a 5-minute window beginning right at the first part of our 4:30, for example, I don't think we would have made it without some fairly significant changes. At that time of day, I think we had pretty significant overhang from the thunderstorms off to the west. We even had, right at the beginning of the window, we had showers and buildups within our 20-mile circle, even closer than that. So we probably would have had to think really hard about any kind of a waiver for that. There are some things that we just won't be able to do, but things like maybe working with our ceiling constraints and ceiling and visibility combinations, and maybe some on these overhang situations where if we can get data that better specifies or tells us what the electrical field potential in those clouds is, then maybe we can come off of some of those a little bit and not have to worry about whether it's opaque or not. If it doesn't have the potential, then we go ahead and maybe relax the constraint. But throughout most of the window today, we would have had to go for some kind of waiver to make that with our current rules. And at the beginning of the window, I don't think we were there. We couldn't have made it.
Hi, Ross Cabot with Channel 9 for Bob. A couple of pre-launch briefings, folks had mentioned this was kind of a treat, a late afternoon launch. Got to work kind of a regular shift, and I wondered what you would prefer, working late afternoon launch with the fickle weather, or playing it safe, launching at night when the weather's a bit more understandable.
Well, I think you look back through the data, our track record of getting off at the beginning of the window is better if we try to launch in the morning, and so I would prefer to give up a night of sleep for that anytime.
Okay, I believe Jim McKenna has a question.
Jim McKenna with Aviation Week. How, after all the talk about the engines, what do you know about how they perform going uphill?
Well, as far as I know right now, everything was fine. The startup, I think, was okay. We watched, we have displays available. We watched some of, for example, the turbine outlet temperatures, and everything that we could tell was nominal throughout, stayed nominal throughout. The throttle bucket was nominal, the throttle down and throttle back up. And the MECO was at, all those things occurred on the appointed times. From what I can tell, monitoring, from my past experience and monitoring the calls that I listened to the flight director internal loop, and those calls for boundary modes that go up to the crew appeared to be pretty much right on time, and there were no calls about performance variation. So I think everything went fine, but I don't have detailed data.
And how about the same question for the SRBs?
Again, same answer. I think all of that went just fine, and the performance, I think, was nominal, and the separation was pretty much nominal on time.
Okay. Houston reported a comm loss after they were up and in orbit. Any indication as of yet as to what may have caused that?
That one I don't have any details on, other than hearing them say that they had lost some data, and then I changed rooms, and when I got to the new room, they were talking again. So I don't know why necessarily, and for how long, and the reason.
Okay. my last one is you mentioned this lightens load a bit for the rest of the year. How does it lighten load for you, and what's the game plan now for the rest of the year?
Oh, well, I guess my meaning there for lightening the load was that, of course, when we had to reschedule 68, that affected not just the remainder of this year, but it reflects well into next year as well, as you've probably seen some new dates for the 105 missions already. That's pretty much what I meant, is that with all the customers that the range has to fly from here on the East Coast, every time somebody goes on time, it's really nice.
Sue Butler?
This is for Bob. Excuse me. Could you just take off your launch director's hat for a moment and put on your meteorologist hat? And Lauren was talking about maybe loosening the rules, and we kept seeing all this blue and hearing all this about the cloud debris, which we really didn't see that well. Would you be in favor, considering we have to make 5-minute launch windows with the Russians, would you consider loosening the rules for weather, speaking as a meteorologist?
The rules that maintain a safe ascent or RTLS, those that are associated with the potential for triggering lightning or flying through rain, at this point, we're not smart enough to change those rules with any additional data. If you recall, we've had an airborne field mill program in place for some time, collected a lot of information from that, and we're looking for the result of that effort to come to fruition someday in terms of an airborne sensor that can characterize clouds that could potentially trigger lightning, and we want to avoid those kind of clouds. Right now, the rules protect us from avoiding those kind of clouds. They may be more conservative than they need to be, but we don't know that yet until the scientific community can converge on that data and change the rules if they're able to do that. So until they can converge on that and make recommendations to the program, I wouldn't want to change the rules in spite of the 5-minute launch window pressure. I would rather be safe.
And, I guess this is for either of you gentlemen. We heard Susan Helm saying she saw a large, irregular-shaped item, which probably looked like one of the largest pieces of ice she had ever seen, and the answer from the ground was, we've seen it before. So when and where could this ice have been formed, considering your ice team presumably was on the job before the launch?
Ice characteristically forms around the hydrogen umbilical between the orbiter and the tank. And the most suspect source for that ice would be that area. Sometimes it comes off in a lot of little pieces over a period of some seconds going uphill. Sometimes it comes off in a clump and holds together. And we cannot confirm that one way or another until we get the playback from the films, which will be sometime tomorrow.
And one more question, which really should be answered by Johnson, I realize, but I haven't been able to get an answer. We heard George Dill, I think, talk about AOA to Edwards if necessary. The press kit said White Sands. We all remember what happened to the orbiter when you landed on STS-3 there, so nobody wants to go there. We understand that. But why do you keep plugging White Sands when you really intend to go to Edwards if you need to? And I couldn't get an answer out of JSC.
Well, let's see. We use White Sands for AOA on the high inclination missions from here because for an AOA scenario, they're really the only ones that are in position that we can land at. I don't think we can do a deorbit for an AOA situation and make Edwards.
And did he misspeak when he mentioned Edwards for AOA?
Well, Edwards for an high inclination launch is usually in terms of a first day PLS. What we're protecting there is landing not on the first rev, but on a usually a third or later rev.
Joe?
Joe Walsh, Mutual Broadcasting. I'd like to return to the weather for a moment because as you all went down to the 5-minute point, weather was touch and go, and I know you had your fingers crossed. What was the deciding factor that gave you the confidence to go for launch, and how much of a role did John Casper play in this with his visual observation?
I think the SDA observations were a key factor in the final clearance by the SMG folks back in Houston. They they can see a certain amount from images, various types of images that they have available, but there's probably just no real substitute for looking at some things, with that airplane out there. So, John was saying what he thought he could see and passing on that information, and I think those folks back in Houston at the SMG finally got comfortable that the last thing that they were worried about was one little area of a shower that built up fairly far out, about 35 miles, and then it had the potential for throwing up some more of the anvil type cirrus. And as long as we could make sure that we could get this roughly half-hour window to do for an RTLS situation, then that would be good. And that's by telling him where he saw it and what he saw on the leading edge of it, them knowing the steering winds and the magnitude of those, I think that all worked out. They arrived at their conclusion.
Bill Harwood?
Bill Harwood, to follow up Jim McKenna's last question, which is, I assume you're still looking at October the 2nd. Are there any challenges for 68 to make the 2nd? And on 66, are you still looking at around November 3rd, or is there some way to pull that back to the 27th at this point? What's the latest thinking?
Well, from a work standpoint, 68 should roll out to the pad early Monday morning. And at this point in time, we've targeted a no earlier than date of October 2nd. That's the first date that's available from the range from the last week in September on, and there's some contingency time to get there, so we'd be comfortable with that date. The STS 66, that one is it's not really clear to us at this point in time whether we're talking late September or late October, early November for that one. We're currently on the range for the 27th of October. But that date looks a little soft based on the engine availability. We don't expect to get the engines for that until the first week in October, and are looking at a vertical installation of that. So there's still some unknowns in that one. That could go into early November, yes.
Dan Billow?
Bob, I was looking at radar screens that showed rain all over Florida. I thought it looked pretty bad for much of the time. Did you ever think, looking at the weather, that it was hopeless?
No. Again, keeping in mind that the weather just has to be good enough for long enough, and it is Florida. As in the summertime, in the afternoon, as the heating trails off, as it were, the sun gets lower, temperatures go down, and the showers dissipate. And if you recall, if you look at a time lapse of those, the showers were occurring. There were more of them over Florida, but they were further away from the Kennedy Space Center area, which also improves our ability to fly. So considering we had a 2.5-hour window, as it were, for this one, I think a lot of us felt somewhere in that 2.5 hours it would be good enough for long enough. Just take some patience, and I think after it's all said and done, if we have a choice as to when we can launch in the summer, obviously we'd like to go in the morning, but we're driven by payload and mission requirements many times, so we have to do this. But going into it, we know our probability is lower than it would be for a morning launch. But as far as today was concerned, sure, we thought there's a chance, or we wouldn't even have tried.
Jim McKenna with Aviation Week again. In looking at the 66 workflow, do you take any opportunity to insert some slack in that, or ease up on the tight constraints that you've got, given the fact that Titan's now targeting November 4 for their launch date?
At this point in time, our goal is to get out of the orbiter processing facility with a clean orbiter and get the engines ready in parallel with that activity, and we'll integrate those two together hopefully the first week in October. And then we'll see where we are, we'll see where the other range customers are, and converge on a launch date.
Are there any additional questions here at KSC? There's one in the back. Please wait for the microphone.
Very simple but very general, from George Meek, Voice of America. What lessons, if any, have been learned from today's launch?
Well, I think that what's reinforced to me is that we need to, when we set a launch, first of all, when the program sets a launch date, that we have taken into account all the requirements, and that we're sure that the launch period that we've set for ourselves is the best one that satisfies the customer requirements and has the highest chance of satisfying things like seasonal weather. As we know, we have a pretty good volume of data on that, and I think that was done in this case. And then I think the other thing is that even though weather forecasting is a fine art, I think Bob would agree with that, forecasters are getting smarter and smarter. They've got more data available, at least put it that way. And they're better able to do a job of trending. And forecasters throughout our this past week, and especially our L-2 and L-1 days, I think they told us exactly what was going to happen, and the weather pattern turned out to be pretty much exactly what they said. And so there's probably some lessons that we can take home there. I'm sure you're always going to miss now and then, but when you get up in the morning and you come to the first part of the period and it looks kind of bleak, hang in there. It might turn out all right.
Okay, any additional questions? We have no questions from the other centers. That concludes the briefing, and thank you.
Discovery Houston, we're experiencing Radicom. We're off the nose. We have an action on panel MA73 Charlie when somebody's available.
Go ahead.
On MA73 Charlie, row Bravo, we'd like the position of the MCA Logic main C mid 4 switch.
Okay, mid 4 is off. It must have been bumped. You want it to go on?
That's affirmed. We'd like that switch on.
Yes. Okay, it's on now.
This is Mission Control Houston. Discovery's maneuvering into the proper orientation for opening of the payload bay doors on board. The crew asked there to check the position of one of the switches in its configuration as they prepare for the door opening. That switch had been bumped, as the crew just reported, back to Capcom Brent Jet.
Discovery Houston, we see our problem resolved on the mid-MCA with the switch action. You got about 3 minutes to attitude. When you're there, you have a go to open the payload bay doors.
Okay, Brent, thanks. We'll open the doors when we get to attitude.
Again, that was a switch that had been bumped, and the crew was just asked to move it back into the proper position. With that, now the crew has a go for opening the payload bay doors when they get into the proper orientation in about 3 minutes or so. On board Discovery, all activities are proceeding smoothly as the crew prepares to open the payload bay doors. That activity coming up in just a few minutes.
Houston Discovery on speaker mic. How do you read?
Loud and clear, Susan.
And we got you.
Once the payload bay doors have been opened on board Discovery, the crew will be standing by for a go for orbit operations, go that signals that Discovery is in good shape for an extended stay in orbit.